With RASTAKHAN'S rumble looming upon the WoW community, it's around time to reflect on the current expansion, take what we've learned, and speculate about the future. One of the things that we found interesting from the Boomsday project was how it modified decks from previous expansions in the WoW format. Barring the recently dethroned Star Aligner, all other new and modified decks of this expansion took a weaker deck from a prior meta and supercharged it with additional synergy from the Boomsday set. And RASTAKHAN'S rumble is less than 3 weeks away from being unleashed. With the WoW meta being less volatile to the introduction of new expansions, we hypothesized some of the decks that might shake up the meta in RASTAKHAN'S rumble even before the majority of cards have been released. Here are 5 wild archetypes that we believe are on the cusp of playability in the wild format, which have the potential to become supercharged over the next few weeks. 1. Egg Druid. One of the decks that got a boost in power out of Boomsday was Egg Druid. It was a significant presence in the wild meta up until Kobolds and Catacombs, with strong cards like Sir Finley Murgleton and Jeeves keeping the hyper-aggressive deck a very strong ladder choice. Unfortunately for the deck, with the introduction of more robust aggro decks, control decks became more anti-aggro, and with healing and armor gain becoming more rampant in the format, the deck has steadily become less and less viable since Knights of the Frozen Throne was released. Despite the loss of strength in the recent past, when looking at the bigger picture of WoW's history, Aggro Druid has been rather resilient over time. Initially, the deck relied on an egg synergy, which allowed for additional stickiness against control decks. The archetype became more aggro-based as new cards like Living Mana were printed, and as of recently adapted a bit more, playing to the early game mech synergy introduced with Boomsday. Even with Druid's Aviana nerf at the midway point of this expansion, Aggro Druid is still one of the weaker variants of Druid due to Jade Druid's success. However, with the promotion of Token Druid in Standard, there is a good chance that a new addition to the deck may come in the upcoming months and bring the deck back into the limelight. While there are outliers, cards that could help push this deck forward typically would be found in the 1 to 4 mana slot, and contain effects such as board AoE buffs or multiple token summoning cards. Traditionally, this deck is hyper-aggressive, so sticky cheap cards or cards that spread wide on board do well for this deck's win rate. With the announcement of RASTAKHAN, Druid has been dubbed Team Raptor. This is extremely encouraging for aggro Druid, as Raptors often hunt in packs, and hopefully this means that there are a few cards released this expansion that capitalize on the theme of swarming the board and creating multiple minions quickly, which is exactly what aggro Druid is looking for. 2. Even Mage. Another deck that's been lying in the shadows but has the potential to gain some upside in the wild meta is Even Mage. Even though this deck is technically not a revived deck as it's not seen widespread meta play before, it is the second archetype on our list as we are really excited in the potential of this budding archetype. With the nerf to Mana Worm, there was a significant decrease to the playability of Mage as a whole, as every single non-control version of the class ran the overpowered 1-drop. Some of you may have never heard of Even Mage, but the deck is currently a tier 4 deck that capitalizes on hero power synergy with cards like Garrison Commander, Fallen Hero, Bone Guard Lieutenant, and sometimes value cards like Dalaran Aspirant and Coda Rider. Looking at the current standard card pool, we can predict 2 types of cards which are likely to be printed in this upcoming expansion that would help this deck out a whole bunch in the wild. First, looking at the timing of the Mana Worm nerf, we can deduce that Blizzard is concerned about the strength of aggro Mage variants, as Mana Worm is the catalyst for these decks. As a correlation, with the nerf of Mana Worm, the design space for strong mid-range Mage cards is opened up, because the ability for Mana Worm to snowball games out of control fundamentally prevented Blizzard from printing strong earlier mid-game Mage cards in the past. Now that the design space is open, we are fairly optimistic that a strong card will be added to Mage, and hopefully for Even Mage, it's at the 2 or 4 mana slots. Additionally, one thing to look towards is the set rotation coming up after this next expansion. With the yearly card rotation, the standard set will be removing Keleseth, which is one of the strongest aggro cards in the format. All aggro decks, besides Odd and the recently nerfed aggro Mage, run Keleseth because it's hands down the best 2-drop in the game. With the removal of Keleseth in the spring of 2019, aggro inherently will be weaker in the standard meta. If Blizzard decides not to print more aggro cards, it could significantly warp the meta, which we predict that they'll try to avoid. This means that Blizzard potentially needs to create a good amount of early game minions, now that Keleseth will be rotating next spring. Blizzard has in the past front-loaded things into the game before they were actually needed in the card pool, such as Gadgets and Ferrymen before Quest Rogue and Forlorn Stalker before Mean Streets. One way that Blizzard could potentially mitigate the potential lack of aggro decks is through the creation of additional strong 2-mana minions, to compensate for the eventual removal of Keleseth, which is exactly what Even Mage needs. Strong 2-drops are what this deck lives and dies by, as the more strong 2-drops that Even Mage can run, the more aggressive this deck can be. As we've seen with Even Shaman, if you have strong 2-drops and cheap burn, you have the potential to be one of the strongest decks in the format. Looking at the RASTAKHAN lore, mages have been given John Alai the Dragonhawk as their Loa. In WoW, Dragonhawks are typically mid-sized and have strong effects, which in Hearthstone has been represented by Wind Fury. It is possible that we see a 2 or 4 mana mage minion in this expansion that has Wind Fury, or even a Loa that's 2 mana which gives all minions Wind Fury, which is exactly what this deck is looking for. A way to generate strong tempo presence that can translate into face damage after claiming initial board advantage. 3. Fatigue/Mill Druid. One thing that Wild has is an abundance of strong Druid cards. With options like Branching Paths, Spreading Plague, and Poison Seeds, Druid ultimately has a rather strong control shell. Throughout the recent history of Wild, combo Druid decks have capitalized on this core and run game-winning combos with Aviana and Kun. With the nerf to Aviana, Druid has gone back to being a control class, with Jade Druid being the strongest iteration of the class at the moment. The real question when looking into Control Druid for the next expansion is which fringe Control Druid deck becomes powerful, as opposed to will one become powerful? Let's explore a couple decks and see what each of them would need to proceed. A few expansions ago, during the Wild Open tournament, there was a deck introduced called Fatigue Druid, which ran the defensive Druid control shell, but instead of running combo finishers, ran extra removal and 1 Jade Idol. This archetype's game plan was to run their opponent out of resources, then go infinite with Jades. Fatigue Druid may become more powerful as the next few expansions drop, as Blizzard has released many a strong combo card in the past few expansions. Floop and Juicy Psych Melon are 2 of the main culprits in the Wild meta, and may make Blizzard hesitant to push combo Druid's power level much more, resorting to printing more defensive removal cards. If the next expansion brings more Druid removal cards, expect to see this deck getting some play. Mill Druid was the first mill deck to enter the Hearthstone metagame. With the class's ability to draw your opponent cards during Naturalize, it has always been on the cusp of being a viable deck, but has not had enough tools to compete with the respective combo decks that it's up against. If there were to be more effects introduced into the game which pushed your opponent to draw more cards, or even card draw for both players, then Mill Druid will have a chance to make its debut as a top-tier deck in the Wild metagame. While this general archetype is the only one not directly supported by RASTAKHAN'S lore on this list, it honestly is one of the more likely ones to be seen post-expansion, as the Aviana nerf has temporarily taken Druid out of the Wild metagame. With the polarization of the meta away from Druid decks, Control Druid decks will have an advantage when the expansion causes any meta shifts. As is, the archetype is fairly strong, and if Druid gets absolutely anything controlling whatsoever, this archetype will see the top of the tier list for months to come. 4. Big Rogue. Big Rogue is a recent deck popularized by Wild streamer and personality Dane. The deck involves using Kobold Illusionist along with Necrium Blade and Silver Vanguard. Big Rogue is very similar to Big Priest in the sense that it uses many different ways to cheat out big minions, but it lacks the resiliency that Big Priest has with the resurrect effects, so it compensates by running really sticky minions such as Sneed's Old Shredder and Kel'Thuzad. While this deck is not at the top of the meta, it has the potential to be, and with the direction that Rogue has been pushed in the past few expansions, we fully expect that there will be some cards released this expansion that allow for some forward progress with this archetype. Some of the big things that this deck is looking to receive in this expansion are Death Rattle synergistic cards. Once a number of this type of card have been created, there will be a critical mass of synergy which will vastly improve the consistency of this deck, similarly to what happened over the past few expansions with Death Rattle Egg Hunter. Additionally, we could expect to see any large Death Rattle minion, preferably 8 mana, start pushing this deck into focus, as, similar to Big Priest, the ability to cheat out big minions early is what wins this deck games. In RASTAKHAN, rogues are known as the Sharks, aka the Dirty Cheaters. It seems very appropriate that this is the team that rogues represent, as Big Rogue is desperately looking for cards which help cheat out big minions. Sharks are also notorious for being large power-packing monsters, so hopefully we see some strong large minions as well to help supplement this new deck archetype. 5. Mid-range Dragon Priest. Of all the decks listed in this video, this deck choice may be the most biased, as our writer DannyDonuts has had the mid-range Dragon Priest as his pet deck for the past few expansions. This deck is primed to do well if certain cards are given to it, and if the meta shapes up a certain way after the expansion. This is one of the decks that we're investing in fairly heavily because we expect great things out of it. When looking at the mid-range Dragon Priest, the deck has many ways to fight against aggro, with Dustbreaker and Pyromancer as solid ways to clear early game threats. The big thing that this deck needs is a late game finisher. At the moment, Anduin is the way that you can close out games, turning your value cards into a slow trickle of damage to burn out your opponent. While the current standard model uses Mind Blast, this variant is fairly poor in Wild due to the strength of aggro, especially with the Wild variants of even Shaman and Odd Rogue. What the deck currently needs is a strong value-generating card that can be utilized by Anduin, as you often run out of oomph during some of the value matchups. We honestly would not be surprised to see a card that provides Anduin with insane value this set, as there's only one expansion of overlap with Anduin left. With Rastakhan, Priest has been given the Loa of Bwonsamdi, the Dead. Dragon Priest could potentially get some of the late game finishers that it's been looking for, as Priest has lacked a consistent way to produce damage for a while, and this archetype would really capitalize on a dark damage dealing effect. If the class style focuses more on Death Rattle minions, we could see mid-range Priest be stronger than mid-range Dragon Priest, but traditionally mid-range Death Rattle Priests have underperformed because they lack tempo plays, and Death Rattle Priest decks have become more control-oriented. Dragon Priest hopes that we see more Shadow Word cards and less Death Rattle cards to see relevance. With Rastakhan's Rumble, we expect to have a lot of additional synergy released into the wild. These are 5 fringe deck archetypes that we expect to see strengthened even without seeing many of the new cards of the set. By looking at meta-analysis, available design space, and announced lore of the set, we foresee these 5 archetypes as potential winners once all the cards have been revealed. What do you think? What other decks do you think will see a resurgence next expansion? Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more Tempo Storm news and Hearthstone content. Thanks for watching.